Now I shall look at Margaret Wertheim's look at fringe science. The main videos I will be looking at are Margaret Wertheim's DIY Physics, It's Not Brain Surgery, that place. Science on the Fringe by Margaret Wertheim, Science Show ABC, Radio National, that place. Then it's Physics on the Fringe, part 1 and part 2. So it's those three things. Margaret Wertheim looks at what she considers fringe science. Those of us who think Einstein's wrong are often considered fringe science. So we'll look at what Margaret Wertheim says from that perspective. First look at Eason, and it's at that address there. There we go. This is at Wikipedia. Louis Eason and Louis Eason, FRS, OBE, so forth, fellow of the Royal Society, was an English physicist who's sadly passed away now, 1997. Notable achievements were the precise measurement of time and the determination of the speed of light. He was critical of Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, particularly as it related to time dilation. So what we have is a tradition of us who are very critical of Einstein's relativity, and it's been going on for some time now, and some of us are physicists and so forth, and so it's just not always amateurs. There's been a long tradition of us critical of Einstein that mainstream tries to mostly ignore. So we consider mainstream believes things that are wrong. So that's our perspective on things. So let's have a look at what Margaret Wertheim has to think about things. She gives what I have on her is 3 interviews, so some of it will be duplication. Margaret Wertheim, according to Wikipedia, born 1958, Australia, is a science writer and author of books on the cultural history of physics. She's the author of 3 books that collectively consider the role of theoretical physics in the cultural landscape of modern Western society. The first one, Pythagoras' Treasures. Second one, Pearly Gates of Cyberspace. And the third one, Physics on the Fringe. And in that book she mainly looked at what Jim Carter was saying. And he didn't really have much scientific training according to this. But as I point out, there are people who are scientifically trained and quite high up and who have been critical of Einstein. Right, let's go to the first one, I think, here. So, have I got enough sound? Yeah, let's have a go.
Writing a book at the time about the history of physics and religion, and I used to buy a lot of second-hand academic books from this book dealer in LA. And one day I was in there picking up...
Try and get this from the beginning again. Here we go.
I encountered Jim Carter about 18 years ago through a really bizarre set of circumstances. I was writing a book at the time about the history of physics and religion, and I used to buy a lot of second-hand academic books from this book dealer in LA. And one day I was in there picking up some stuff, and she said, "Oh, Margaret, this package arrived in the mail the other day. I was about to chuck it into the bin when I thought of you." And she handed me this package, and in it was this amazingly sort of fluorescent coloured wall chart which sort of presented this alternative explanation of the periodic table. And on the back side of the chart it had this guy's alternative theory of the creation of the universe. And I thought, my gosh, it's pretty amazing. I've never seen anything like that. this guy was announcing the self-publication of his own book called The Other Theory of Physics, in which he was purporting to present to us a complete alternative theory of the universe. He was completely throwing out relativity and quantum theory, and he was presenting...
Right, there are a lot of people who've done that sort of thing. They've looked at Einstein's relativity and so forth and considered it nonsense, and they've thrown it out and they started again and they come up with their own theory. So there's quite a few people like that out there. If we go to my videos, so I've got videos like this. Use Professor Wertheim, who's looked at Einstein's relativity and has come to the conclusion that Einstein's relativity is nonsense. And so there's quite a few number of us who've come to that conclusion. From my perspective, I look at Einstein, I consider it nonsense, and so I just go back to how physics was before Einstein and say physics before Einstein is much better than Einstein. But there are people who do look at Einstein, consider it nonsense, and then they decide to work out their own theory. So that is where a lot of the confusion can be. If you decide Einstein's wrong, there are lots of theories out there for you to suddenly to look at. From my perspective, I think creating a whole new theory is not a very good idea. It's best to just throw out Einstein and go back to physics as it was. Because if you're looking at all these different theories out there, pet theories, then you can start being critical of those in the same sort of way you were of Einstein. So we'll pick it up again from there. Okay.
And quantum theory, and he was presenting his own physics, really, that he built from the ground up. And Jim isn't alone, because actually I now have a collection of these people. My guy Jim Carter is a very unusual case, because he has so much physics and he does these incredible diagrams and animations of his theories. But I actually have been collecting this stuff for about 15 years, and I've got, 2 large shelves on my bookcase.
I've got a lot of paperwork as well. It's very massive on paperwork, this deciding that Einstein's wrong, and suddenly you then have masses of paperwork of what people have been writing. And so it is very paper intensive.
Shelves on my bookcase full of alternative theories of the universe, and it turns out these guys have their own association. It's called the Natural Philosophy Alliance.
Yeah. So we've got our own sort of group now. We're growing in number. So it used to be in the past that we were more isolated. We were just sort of you used to be a loner. You would come look at Einstein, come to the conclusion it's wrong, and do not really have any much outlet to communicate with it. And now we're forming into a group where more of us are coming together saying Einstein is wrong. So pick that up.
The Natural Philosophy Alliance, and they have annual meetings, and people come from all over the world, and they publish these proceedings which has about 700 pages thick of alternative theories of the universe. And I became intrigued. What does this outpouring of what I've come to call outsider science say about our society's relationship to science in general?
Well, from our perspective, Einstein is wrong. From most of our perspective, that is. Most of us have looked at Einstein and come to the conclusion he's wrong. And as you say, taking that position, you can then go in lots of different directions. You can either work out your own theory or join up somebody else who's got their own theory, or you can decide just go back to Newtonian physics or go back to something else. So from my point of view, I just go back to Newtonian physics. I don't see the move to Einstein was any improvement, or it's just making things bad. But there are more of us joining up. We are now more aware that Einstein is wrong. There's growing numbers of us. But she wants to look at it from another sort of perspective, and we don't really look at it from that perspective. We say, well, Einstein's just wrong.
To science in general. I don't actually think that any of the people that I've met have actually got theories that are ever going to be taught at Harvard or Princeton. I don't think they're ever going to win the Nobel Prize, and nor do I think they should.
The thing is with the Nobel Prize system, it has been awarded for prizes that are related to Einstein's work, and so from our perspective those prizes are now backing something which is wrong, so we're not really concerned about that. Most of us, we don't say, well, the Nobel Prize system has gone wrong as well. Einstein sent us on the wrong path, and Nobel Prizes have been awarded for that, and so people are just building upon things that are wrong now in the mainstream. So, don't concern us.
They should. What they are doing is, as it were, they are a reaction to the fact that the mainstream physics theories have got so difficult to understand. Things like general relativity and string theory and hyperspace theory, these incredibly beautiful, elaborate, but highly mathematical, highly technical theories that physicists are now saying this is how we describe the...
Well, the thing is with that's her perspective, that those sort of theories are hard to understand, but that's not necessarily our perspective, because as I point out, we've got a professor, for instance, Professor Roger Ryden, and there's other people, the scientists and so forth, amateurs and so everything, and we've looked at what Einstein has to say, we've looked at the maths, and we've come to the conclusion it's nonsense. So that's our understanding of what Einstein's talking about. Our understanding is Einstein's talking nonsense, and so the mainstream, if they're building on that, they are building on nonsense. So her point of view is hard to understand. No, that's not most of our point of view. Most of our point of view is we understand what's going on. It's nonsense.
Physicists are now saying this is how we describe the ultimate nature of reality. These theories have become inaccessible to almost everybody.
Yeah, inaccessible. And the problem we have identified, the problem with that is it's nonsense. People are finding physics inaccessible because it's been built on what Einstein's saying. We've looked at what Einstein's saying. We've looked at the consequences of that, and we've decided it's nonsense. That's why it's inaccessible.
Almost everybody. I mean, even most trained physicists have a pretty hard time understanding string theory. In fact, most
scientists have a hard time understanding string theory. Now, string theory is built upon, in a large extent, upon what Einstein's talking about. So we're saying Einstein's wrong. They're building on nonsense, and so that's why they find it so difficult to understand things like string theory. So string theory is nonsense. It's not a question of having difficulty understanding it. The understanding of what Einstein's saying is that you should understand that he's talking nonsense. So if you're trying to build a theory such as string theory based upon that, what you're dealing with is nonsense.
Have a pretty hard time understanding string theory. In fact, most trained physicists will tell you that they really don't understand it.
Don't understand it. Most scientists don't understand string theory, and our point of view is that string theory is nonsense. Probably on the parts that are coming from Einstein. There's probably other parts of it which are not too bad, but that's what you're doing. You're building on nonsense. That's why they're having so hard a time understanding it.
So where does that leave the ordinary person? One of the big issues that's confronting our society now with theoretical physics is that there are so many competing theories of physics.
Well, there's lots of competing theories of physics in the mainstream, and in the alternative physics sector there's also lots of competing theories, so it's lots of things. And I just blame Einstein for that, because Einstein's made such a mess of physics that people were trying to make sense of things, and Einstein's just sent them all on the wrong track.
Physics, both in mainstream physicists and from outside the mainstream. Part of the issue is going to be how we as a society are going to work out which theories we'll pay attention to, and indeed which theories we're going to spend lots of money testing.
Well, that from our point of view, it has become sort of dogma in the mainstream that they want to build upon what Einstein was talking about, and so they try to stop movement away from that. So when it comes to spending vast amounts of money, it's based upon a belief in carrying on with what Einstein's talking about. Even though they don't understand what Einstein's talking about, that they will carry on dogmatically trying to stick to that way of doing it. When it's dogmatic like that, it's like they've turned physics into religion, where they thought the religion is you've got to follow what Einstein believes.
Lots of money testing, and one sees this playing out now vis-a-vis string theory. It becomes a practical economic question. How much is our society going to spend on searching for true theories of reality, and how are we going to decide among all the competing theories which ones we're going to put our vast instruments to work searching for? Our society spends hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars on these. There should be some gatekeeping going on here.
Gatekeeping, well, when we get to the gatekeeping is to block people who are saying that Einstein is wrong. That's where the gatekeeping is happening at the moment. And if you want some gatekeeping other way, in some other direction, well, that's not what's going on. The gatekeeping is to try to block protests against Einstein and try to keep physics rigidly stuck in the rut it's in at the moment.
Going on here. But when anyone can post their theories online, as these guys can do now, and the internet has been the biggest boom in the world to outsider theorists, you can go online and find thousands of alternative theories of the universe. How are we going to judge? One of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, that is the problem, is how are you going to judge? I mean, if you're looking at Einstein and looking at the physics based upon Einstein, and you're not going to understand what that means, as she's pointing out that a lot of physicists don't understand string theory. So that's the position you're in. You're sort of like, they're just blindly accepting physics which they don't understand. And from our point of view, we've looked at sort of physics and decided it's nonsense. You shouldn't be doing physics that way. You should be doing something else. So as long as people are going to dogmatically want to believe in something that they don't understand, then that's going to be a continuation of the corruption.
Enlightenment is that, in the last 200 or 300 years, we've, as it were, given people the means of production in all sorts of ways that were unthinkable in the past. So, for instance, in the 18th century, almost nobody would ever hear an orchestra play. Almost no one would even hear a violin play.
What you're talking about there is the poor people wouldn't hear that, and the majority of people were poor, and you had the upper classes who were rich, and they could go off for entertainment like that, and probably the poor people, all they were doing was day-to-day living, working and so forth, didn't have time for entertainment things. So it was the upper classes who were more into the arts and so forth back then. So it's not so much of what it is like nowadays. We have more people who are able to go into entertainment and into science and everything else. There's more sort of spare time for that, whereas before it would have just been the idle rich to a large extent who've had time for doing things like that.
Play. But now anyone can download samples of the London Philharmonic and create a symphony in their own bedroom. In the 16th century, almost nobody could read, let alone write. And now anyone with a laptop can write their own book and actually publish it online. We applaud this, as it were, expansion of the means of production in the DIY culture. Like, here we are at the Big Think making our own fantastic television program. And we all think this is a good thing. So part of what I'm asking in this book is, where do we draw the line with the DIY ethos? Is it unacceptable to have a DIY theory of physics?
Why would it be unacceptable to have a DIY physics? That's basically what we're doing. You've got the mainstream science community and you've got the alternative science community, and so we who are in the alternative decide the mainstream's gone wrong, and so we're doing our own physics and so forth. So what's wrong with that? eventually, hopefully, the mainstream will collapse with all its false beliefs and we will go back to correct physics. Okay, so now I've got another little talk from her, Science on the Fringe. It might be, I'm going through 3 of her talks, so some of it might be duplication from her.
When I first started working on nuclear structure, I tried to decide a shape of a particle that could be fitted together mechanically, so that the
This is Jim Carter's theory, and it's not really that much interested in it, but I'm more interested in saying Einstein's wrong, rather than looking at all these different theories which are trying to replace Einstein.
nucleus of the various elements could all be fitted together in a mechanical process. I came up with the idea of the circlon, a circular shaped particle that's hollow in the middle, like a hollow ring. If you had a microscope which allowed you to peer down to the very nucleus and be able to see the structures at their fundamental levels, all you would see is these circlon-shaped particles.
How did you come to meet Jim Carter?
I met Jim through a very unlikely sequence of events. When I was researching my first book, Pythagoras' Trousers, I used to buy a lot of second-hand books from this academic bookseller in LA. And one day I was picking up the complete works of Descartes when she handed me a package and said, "This arrived in the mail today." I was about to throw it into the bin when I thought of you. I've never quite known why she thought of me, but it was an announcement from Jim Carter about the imminent self-publication of a book which claimed to be a complete alternative theory of physics. And I was rather intrigued by this because he included in the package a wall chart on the one side of which was his alternative theory of the creation of the universe, and on the other side his alternative theory of the periodic table. And I thought this was an interesting and visually stunning body of work, so we started corresponding.
And this, of course, is not Jimmy Carter, the engineer who was President of the United States. This is Jim Carter, who lived in the, well, boondocks in some ways, repairing cars and trucks.
Yes, Jim he has no education beyond high school. He has been a gold miner, an abalone diver. He's gone in search of lost meteorites. He's dug secret caves with a hand chisel underneath his property. And he lives in a...
So presumably not a professional scientist, and presumably just an amateur, and amateurs can be very skilled, but I personally am not really interested in looking at all these different theories that different people come up with. I'm more interested in pointing out that Einstein is wrong. We should never have gone in that direction with Einstein, so that's my point of view on it. And when she's picking on somebody as being an amateur, well, she could actually look at professionals who say Einstein's wrong and look at their sort of theories that they come up with if she wanted to. From my point of view, amateurs can be very gifted and come up with very good ideas.
Beautiful piece of property about an hour south of Seattle, in a beautiful piece of forest on top of a cliff, and he runs a trailer park there. He's the proprietor of the trailer park, and they do everything from install the sewer lines and the power lines, and he has a fleet of old Chryslers and Cadillacs that he lovingly repairs. And Jim sees the universe as a giant machine, just as he believes he can lift up the hood of a car and understand the machinery.
And from my point of view, nothing wrong with that. It's a good idea to do that, and I think she's going to point out that's the way that Newton would look at it, that the universe is some sort of mechanical machine, and I think that's a good way of looking at it. And so nothing wrong with that as far as I'm concerned. If you're going to construct a theory which is going to be mechanical and it's going to predict things that can be used, well, that's good. But just I'm not particularly interested in looking at that particular thing. I'm more, as I say, more concerned with pointing out Einstein's wrong.
extraordinary there, so too he believes he can, as it were, lift up the hood of the universe and understand the cosmic machine.
Well, of course, if I receive a book like that, and I have done on many an occasion, the first thing I do is, with tongs, put it over there in the far distance, and you...
Hello? So, putting it away with tongs, that's shown he's prejudiced against looking at other ideas, so he's not open-minded, so it's not very good.
And I have done on many an occasion, the first thing I do is, with tongs, put it over there in the far distance, and you do the opposite. You not only look at it and read it, you also get in touch with Jim. How did you manage to reach him?
Oh, well, it wasn't at all easy to find him because he had his address and phone number on his letter that he sent out.
So just gave him a call?
Well, yeah, I mean, he wanted feedback. So I gave him a call, and I happened to be going up to give a lecture in that area, and so I just hired a car and went out to visit him. And it never crossed my mind when I first encountered this subject of what I've come to call outsider physics that I would write a book about it. I thought it was an interesting subject potentially for a magazine article, but I became fascinated by Jim's life, this bizarre sort of fantastical universe that he inhabited, where he was literally doing things like going off in search for meteorites and dreaming up his own theory of physics and building his own house and building his own cars. And it occurred to me that what he was doing, that Jim lived the ultimate American pioneer dream. He was the DIY person, and that sort of American pioneer spirit that is celebrated in so much, movies, it's part of the mythos of America, actually is pretty absent now, where most people have become, really dependent on experts. They can't fix things themselves.
Dependent upon experts, and that is a bad thing to be. People really need to think for themselves, and Jim Carter is pointing out that he's thinking for himself, and this is probably a problem with these people who consider themselves intellectuals but are not really that clever. They sort of prefer to go by the word of experts, and the experts are not the ones that are trying to enforce the dogma about Einstein. You really need to check it for yourself. We people who've checked what Einstein and what the other people who are following Einstein have said, and we've come to the conclusion that it's all nonsense. And it's these people who are going by the word of experts who are trying to enforce a dogma, and they're not thinking for themselves.
The mythos of America actually is pretty absent now, where most people have become, really dependent on experts. They can't fix things themselves. And Jim was an embodiment of this sort of mythical American persona, and he extended it to building his own universe, his DIY enthusiasm taken to the ultimate extreme. And I became fascinated, what drives a person like that? And given that he's not alone, that there are now thousands of these people.
Well, what drives many of us is, we recognise physics has gone wrong. We've studied it and we've tried to make sense of it, and eventually we come to the understanding that it's just nonsense. So in my case, I've had an education in physics, got a degree in physics and maths combined, and looked at it open-minded, tried to make sense of it, and then realised it's just nonsense. And when you realise it's nonsense, you've got to say, well, what else can you do? You've got to put physics back on the right track again.
Enthusiasm taken to the ultimate extreme, and I became fascinated, what drives a person like that? And given that he's not alone, that there are now thousands of these people, what drives them collectively?
Yeah, we're growing in number now. There's more of us coming to the realisation that Einstein is wrong. Hopefully, eventually, there'll be enough of us to realise Einstein's wrong, and then Einstein will be overthrown and physics put back on its correct path.
What does it say about our society's relationship to science, to physics, that they feel the need to reinvent it from the ground up in their basements?
But you see, He also...
Many of us who look at Einstein find it's wrong, decide then to go on the path of rebuilding physics from the ground up. I'm not actually taking that sort of line. I'm sort of like saying, well, physics made more sense before Einstein changed everything, so I just go back to physics as it was. But people do from having taken the position that Einstein's wrong, then do take lots of different directions.
What does it say about our society's relationship to science, to physics, that they feel the need to reinvent it from the ground up in their basements?
But you see, he also built a machine that has smoke rings coming out of it, very nice ones. And those smoke rings are also part of his general theory. How?
Jim believes that at the subatomic level, everything is made up from these little ring-shaped particles that he calls circlons. So he sees the periodic table, for instance, the atomic elements, being his model of them is like a kind of subatomic chain mail with these little rings linked together in these rather complex and rather beautiful patterns. And so he's interested in how can he test his theories about the way these circlon particles behave. And smoke rings are one incarnation at the human scale of a circlon-shaped phenomena. So Jim bashes smoke rings together in his backyard to test how he thinks these particles are behaving. And it's really quite beautiful when you see these things sailing across his lawn and you realise how long-lived they are, how internally stable they are. And what's fascinating to me about Jim's theory is that he's not the first person who's had this theory. That actually, in the 19th century, two of the great British scientists of the 19th century, Lord Kelvin, William Thomson, who we all know, he discovered
Degrees
absolute
Kelvin,
zero,
yeah.
and degrees Kelvin is named after him. He and his colleague, the great mathematician Peter Guthrie Tait, in the 1870s, conceived of a similar theory.
Right, so Lord Kelvin conceived of a similar theory, and this is before Einstein suddenly took over, I think. Lord Kelvin was looking at vortex theory of matter, and he was also considering Boscovich's theory, which I'm supporting. It's a theory, a unified theory, and you've got the idea that for Boscovich things are made up from point particles, but you then got second and third order levels of matter. So based up from point particles, you then form other things like loops and so forth. So it is a continuation of Newtonian physics, and with Einstein putting us on the wrong track, this theory was forgotten about. Mainstream suddenly went onto the wrong track with following Einstein. So you've got this resurrection of an old theory pre-Einstein, and it shouldn't have been abandoned, went the wrong way, went with Einstein, and you should have gone back to this theory.
He discovered
Degrees
absolute
Kelvin,
zero,
yeah.
and degrees Kelvin is named after him. He and his colleague, the great mathematician Peter Guthrie Tait, in the 1870s, conceived of a similar theory. They were interested in the question, which was big in the 19th century psychology, what are atoms made from? Atoms must be made of some smaller constituent parts. Those parts must be very long-lived and stable. What are they? And Tait and Thomson spent 30 years trying to demonstrate, by bashing smoke rings together, that atoms were made up of some kind of subatomic version of smoke rings. So I find that fascinating. Here you have some of the leaders of modern physics and Jim Carter, separated by 150 years.
In this grand cosmology that Jim Carter produced, is there any real substance to it at all?
In the terms that you really want to know, Robert, which is it ever going to be taught in Harvard and Princeton? Is he ever going to win the Nobel Prize? The answer is definitively no. I don't believe that Jim's theories or any of the outsiders that I've encountered would ever be taught at University Physics Department, and I don't believe they should.
Well, that looks like the situation at the moment because of the dogma of Einstein. They're imposing a dogma about the belief in Einstein, and based on that dogma, then things are very hard to break through and get this alternative physics presented to them. So from our point of view, Einstein is wrong. The mainstream have insisted on staying wrong, and they've carried on building upon that. So you need to overturn all the mistakes that they've been building upon to get physics back on the right track.
Jim's theories or any of the outsiders that I've encountered would ever be taught at the University Physics Department, and I don't believe they should be. None of them are the next Einstein, although I should say all of them believe they're the next Einstein.
And that's a difficult thing. It's an ego thing, so say to believe you can replace Einstein in a way, because Einstein is being presented as a sort of genius, and so if you do replace Einstein, that means you are a genius. And unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that. When you actually look into things, you realise a lot of people have realised Einstein is wrong, and so when you yourself realise Einstein is wrong, you just become part of another alternative physics community who realise that Einstein is wrong, and you find out that the mainstream have been putting a block on it. They've been trying to forcefully keep Einstein enthroned as a genius when really he's not.
Would be. None of them are the next Einstein, although I should say all of them believe they're the next Einstein. And so that raises the question, well, why am I wasting my time on this rubbish? Why have I spent
why?
years
And writing a book about
writing a book about people who I don't believe are ever going to be validated in the academic sphere? The reason that it fascinates me and why I think it's worth reflecting on is this. At the beginning of the 20th century, some people in the art world began to recognise that there were people outside the mainstream art world who were doing art. Mostly they lived in lunatic asylums. And we invented the term art brut or outsider art. And at the time, most people in the art mainstream would not take it seriously, wouldn't even consider it. But over the past few decades, it's become a huge category of...
So that is a similarity. You've got the mainstream physics community, and they don't really want to consider outsider physics. They don't want to consider it seriously. So outsider physics or alternative physics is just being built up regardless, without mainstream paying any attention to it. Well, mainstream trying to ignore it. And so when it comes to the stages of truth, what you go through is supposed to be 3 stages. The first stage of truth is supposed to be ignored, and that seems to be what the mainstream physics community is doing as regards alternative physics, or people saying that Einstein's wrong. They're trying to ignore it, and that's how they are. It's something deeply psychological wrong with people that they want to do that sort of thing. They form into a group, and those sort of people then want to ignore what is the truth being that Einstein is wrong. So they've done that. And the second stage of truth is it will be ridiculed, and then the third stage after that will be it is accepted as obvious. So that is the stages we have to go through, and at the moment stage 1, mainstream physics is trying to ignore all these people saying that Einstein is wrong. It's just trying to ignore the truth.
Wouldn't even consider it. But over the past few decades, it's become a huge category of the art world. There are whole books, magazines, conferences, degrees, galleries devoted to it. I see this subject that I'm approaching as a similar question. There is this huge emerging world of people who are rejecting mainstream physics, trying to do physics on their own terms. I'm interested in it as a sociological phenomena. We don't expect to validate outsider art in the same terms, or to judge it in the same terms that we judge Picasso or Rembrandt. I don't think we can judge outsider physics in the same terms that we judge Einstein and Newton. What can we say about it? What does it tell us about our society's relationship to science? And I think that's sociologically, it's a worthwhile question.
Well, of course, with art, it has a validity depending on whether anyone actually enjoys it. You know, if it does make any difference with science, it's got to relate to nature. I mean, nature is the ultimate arbiter of whether your equations, whether your theories, whether your rocks and the interpretation of bones actually comes off or not. But the thing I find fascinating about Jim Carter and the like is what you say in your book about the fact that we are now in a world where we cannot understand the very simple machinery of everyday life. Because in the old days, if you tinkered with a motor car, you could actually see how those levers and how those nozzles and how everything else kind of worked. You famously took things apart and put them together again. You can't do that with black boxes in motor cars now. Everything is virtually a black box. And what you describe about Jim is that he was actually doing those things with those cars, the Chryslers and all the rest of it. And his physics seemed to be a kind of cry for something that was tangible about science, that had become intangible with all those strings and all those quantums and all those strange abstractions. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that captures it very well.
All those strange things, so forth, is physics going wrong, basically. And we're talking about black boxes in cars. Well, actually, it's silicon chips and so forth now, isn't it, with microprocessors, and you can actually study electronics engineering, so you can still come at it from a direction of understanding.
Tangible about science that had become intangible with all those strings and all those quantums and all those strange abstractions. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that captures it very well, Robin. Physics, in some sense, has become a victim of its own success, even apart from something like...
No, it hasn't become a victim of its own success. It's become a victim of believing Einstein. And what has happened is Einstein has made lots of mistakes, and suddenly the mainstream has decided to go with those, and that's made the subject incomprehensible to people because it doesn't make any sense anymore. And people who reach the correct conclusion that Einstein is wrong, well, they decide, the majority of people don't want to go with that, they just want to prefer to go with the idea that science is incomprehensible. So they're suffering from a delusion.
Robin, physics, in some sense, has become a victim of its own success, even apart from something like string theory. Let's go to the ones that we really feel sure about. Quantum theory, general relativity. They are descriptions of the universe based on very complicated, difficult to understand mathematics. I mean, even most physicists don't understand these kinds of mathematical abstractions.
I'm saying even these physicists don't understand it. So those physicists who don't understand it, really, they should be coming to the conclusion that it's nonsense. And so they are resisting coming to the conclusion that all of those things are nonsense. And basically, the nonsense part is coming from Einstein. Einstein has introduced a lot of nonsense into physics, and when people are finding, oh, we don't understand this thing, they should be concluding it's nonsense. But instead of doing that, they are concluding, well, you're just going to believe it anyway. That's doing that, it's just completely wrong. People should not accept nonsense.
Understand mathematics. I mean, even most physicists don't understand these kinds of mathematical abstractions. So, but yet they work. You know, GPS satellites.
Well, on the GPS satellite, we have a GPS engineer, Von Hatch, in our group, and he says they don't use relativity. So that is from a practical point of view. And so when they're saying things like, oh, GPS works because of relativity, no, it doesn't. They're just doing a publicity thing. It's just a false advertising. They're saying, oh, how wonderful Einstein's relativity is, and they're just making up these false claims about it. So it's not.
Abstractions. So, but yet they work. You know, GPS satellites use corrections from both special and but both special and general relativity, which is
And part of the problem there is the issue of, is special relativity really Einstein's 1905 paper, or is it really what Lorentz is talking about? There is controversy over exactly what is meant by it, and I think the Lorentz version makes more sense than what Einstein was talking about. And so it's all these sort of things are getting muddled in.
Satellites use corrections from both special
Relativity.
and but both special and general relativity,
Yeah.
which is mind blowing. So on some profound level, these
Saying mind blowing, really, rather than have your mind blown, you should be looking at what Einstein's saying and deciding it's nonsense. Instead of deciding you're going to believe it and have your mind blown, you should look at it and say it's nonsense. And if you're going to go by all these supposed claims about experiments and so forth, then all you're doing is buying the publicity campaign which is put out for Einstein, which is just false advertising.
So on some profound level, these theories are right. They literally work and we run our lives by them. But the descriptions of reality...
On some level they're right, well, on some level they are, because Lorentz's theory makes more sense than Einstein's, and he's using the same sort of maths. But what we have from Einstein, he just messes it up.
are right. They literally work and we run our lives by them. But the descriptions of reality have become so inaccessible that 99% of the population can't understand them. Now, Stuart Kauffman, the complexity theorist, famously said that one of the points of science is to help us to feel at home in the cosmos. And that's been a cry that's been taken up over the past 10 years by a lot of champions of science, including people like Stephen Weinberg, Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins. And I believe this. I do think science should help us to feel at home in the cosmos. But if the articulation of the science is inaccessible to 99% of the population, then who gets to feel at home in the cosmos? What Jim and the outsiders are saying.
Right, so who gets to feel at home in the cosmos? Now, if you're looking at the science which has come out from Einstein, it does not really make any sense when you look at it deeply. It doesn't make any sense. And so if you're trying to work from the idea that science should make the universe comprehensible, then going from Einstein does not make any sense. And you should really reach the conclusion that Einstein is wrong from that. And that many of us have reached the conclusion that Einstein is wrong because of that. And so if you then jettison Einstein, as the way I do it, you just go back to Newtonian physics and things make a lot more sense. But people who decide, oh, science doesn't make any sense, but we accept it anyway, well, that is totally bad. It's a totally bad thing to do, and it's just deluded of them to do something like that.
Percent of the population, then who gets to feel at home in the cosmos? What Jim and the outsiders are saying is we believe science is the right way to describe the world. We're absolutely pro-science. We look at the science that we read about, they try to read Stephen Hawking, they try to read Brian Greene.
So the alternative physics people, she's saying, are pro-science, and that is true to some extent. You do get a mixed bag. But a large number of people who have gone over to alternative science from having looked at Einstein, decided he's wrong, and now alternative science, and they just want science put back on the correct path.
Pro-science. We look at the science that we read about, they try to read Stephen Hawking, they try to read Brian Greene. I say it just comes across to them as incomprehensible gobbledygook.
Well, it's not. It's gobbledygook, yeah, but we understand that is nonsense. So we read all these things. Yeah, we've come to our conclusion. It's gobbledygook. It's nonsense. Now, what do? We either go and make our own theory up, or go back to how physics was before Einstein, or follow somebody else's theory. But we just abandon Einstein. Einstein is wrong.
They don't feel at home in that universe. And so they say, we need to have a new science that I can feel at home in. And I think this is a very, very serious social problem at the moment. If our descriptions of the universe are inaccessible, what do we expect people to do? Some people give up just say, well, I'll never understand that.
Yeah, some people give up, they never understand it. But we who've actually looked at it and gone further than that, we're not going to give up. We looked at it and we said, well, it's gobbledygook, it's nonsense.
Some people do what the creationists are doing and say, well, I reject it altogether.
Unfortunately, with the creationists, they want to go by what the Bible says, and that's not a very good way of doing science, really. You should be going by observations of nature for science. You shouldn't be going by the dictates of what the Bible say, but that's a totally another issue altogether.
Give up. Just say, well, I'll never understand that. Some people do what the creationists are doing and say, well, I reject it altogether.
And try to undermine it.
And try to undermine it. My people are actually, I think, doing something rather brave and courageous. They say, we can understand science, but it has to be reconceived.
Yeah, we can understand science. We understand that Einstein's talking nonsense, and so we throw him away.
They say, we can understand science, but it has to be reconceived. And whether you and I agree with them, I think those of us who love science are called upon to respond to this issue.
Yeah. The difference between you and me is you can actually do the maths and I can't. So I'd like to think that I'm part of you and me, but I suspect I'm not in that league. But how did you get on with Jim, personally? You've known him for years.
Jim is a wonderful man to be with. And I have to say, I've come to understand, since meeting many hundreds of outsiders since Jim, that I'm extremely lucky that he was the first one I ran into. The biggest quality about Jim that is so rare is he has a sense of humour. He's got a really beautiful, wicked sense of humour. And although he truly believes he's the next Newton, he can also joke about his position as an outsider. Most of them are so deadly serious. And they're also very angry about their, as it were, exclusion. They don't understand why the mainstream is rejecting them.
Yeah, it's a psychological issue. We've looked at Einstein and realised Einstein's nonsense, and why the mainstream want to keep that dogma. Well, some of us are quite upset about that.
Whereas Jim is almost so certain that he's the next Newton. His feathers don't get ruffled like a lot of the others.
Newton, when he was a little boy, was always making all these models of things, carving wood models of clocks and all kinds of things. Even when he was very little, he had a whole little set of tools and was always making something mechanical. And, you know, I can identify with Newton in a lot of ways because his idea of a mechanical universe is basically very similar to mine.
He's also just had an amazing life. It's extraordinary to spend time with somebody who's digging a secret cave out of the cliff beneath his house. I've come to have immense admiration for this man who can physically do anything.
Yeah, well, Jim may be an absolutely charming fellow, but how does he feel about being exposed to be wrong? You know, someone works out that this doesn't operate and your whole theory's failed. Is he scared of that?
Well, one can probably rest assured that that's not going to happen, Robin, because most physicists won't give this stuff the time of day. So, you know, he would love it if he could get some concrete feedback from a physicist.
Yeah, most physicists won't give it the time of day. That's it, stage one, where they ignore the truth. So, got a long way to go yet if they're going to ignore the truth. They're so wrapped up in their own egos, but they're going to ignore the truth, basically.
He'd absolutely, that's what many of them want, but they can't get any response at all.
I see.
But let's say it happened, and I do know of one or two cases where a mainstream physicist has given an outsider feedback. And what tends to happen is that, and I find this when I talk with Jim, if you gently sort of point out, well, what about this kind of rather logical difficulty in your theory, what they will do is they'll usually find some elaborate sequence of events in their theory why this actually works, despite whatever it is you've said. So these people are psychologically extremely...
And that's sort of thing that the mainstream does anyway. In the mainstream, they got theories which explain things, and they don't fully work. So so say, if you were going by Einstein, you've got apply it to cosmology, and then you've got things which you don't understand, and they're given names like dark matter and dark energy, and they're supposed to be still things you're trying to work out. So even in mainstream, they want to do that. They want to come up with elaborate excuses when their theorising starts failing.
Good, but as it were, finding a patchwork fix. And you get to realise after a time, I mean, I used to try this gently with Jim, and then I realised after a while, look, there's no point in that. You know, the whole thing, from the point of view of a mainstream physicist, the whole thing doesn't stand up from the word go.
Well, the mainstream physicist will probably be tied up and believe in delusions about Einstein. It'd be very hard for them to jettison that and to look at things from another way.
If one's going to try to deal with this, there's no point in dealing with it on that level. It's so manifestly wrong from the ground.
Well, that's only from the perspective of believing in Einstein again, probably. From our perspective, Einstein is manifestly wrong.
No. But I'm interested in how they proceed with the science totally on their own.
And what they do with it, because you see, not only is it useful, as you said in the beginning, you can make, you know, with quantum theory, you can make electronics, which is how we're operating the studio. With relativity, you can operate GPS.
That's it. It's all forced again. With quantum physics, I'm not so attacking that so much, and with relativity, they just make false claims about it. As I pointed out, they make this false claim about GPS.
But with these way out theories, they fit nowhere else in the world, not even with another loony theory.
Well, I disagree with that. Some of the theories do fit together. Well, you can look at what's going on as a sort of mathematical modelling process where somebody will propose something like a theory or some equations, and those equations do work to a certain extent in a limited situation, and then somebody else has got a different set of equations and they work in another set of range of applications, and really you combine them into a more complicated theory and into a more complicated set of maths, and that would describe an even larger range of applications. So they work as sort of approximations. Many theories act as approximations.
You know, there's very little mesh with anything.
Yes.
And that's the problem. That's what makes it totally different.
Exactly. I mean, there is no essential ecology here. So one of the huge things about modern science is that it is created by hundreds, if not thousands of years of history by people working in...
Thousands of history. Really, what is modern science is really starting up from the Copernican revolution. And before that, it was what they call Aristotle physics. So really, it's sort of building up from what Galileo did and Kepler and Newton and so forth. So it's only a few hundred years really. So
certain traditions together in vast numbers, and we've got to this point because thousands of people beforehand have made contributions.
I mean, we're talking about thousands of people. Well, before the Copernican revolution, there was thousands of people believing in Aristotle physics, and eventually they decided under the Copernican revolution that those people were wrong. So numbers doesn't really count. Large numbers of people can go wrong, and from my point of view, large number of people have gone wrong since Einstein. Einstein's just put them on the wrong track. Simple as that. Newton's theory much better. Back to Newtonian physics.
To it. It is a collective theory. Whether it's right or wrong, it is something that thousands of people have contributed to. And these people, like Jim, they're an ecology of one. They're complete outliers. That is a huge problem for them, because they don't share even often the fundamentals of what they think science should be with the people, with their own colleagues.
Yeah, lots of differences of opinion. It's not enough to just look at Einstein and say he's wrong. It's what do you then do from that? Do you then decide to go back to Newton, or do you want to develop your own theory, or do you want to join in with somebody else's theory, or do you want to even decide that the things went wrong with Newton? It's just too many directions to go in. It's not simple for people.
To a group of dissident physicists called the Natural Philosophy Alliance, and there's a bunch of different people with very different ideas, and some of them it's easy to pick them apart and show that they don't really know what they're talking about. Other ones have some interesting ideas and have gone to a lot of work to explain their theories in ways that can be somewhat convincing. General consensus of the NPA people is that they believe in ether, kind of pre-Einstein kind of theories that they are trying to develop. My theory is really very different, so I'm kind of an outsider there, even among the outsiders.
So it's very, very difficult to see how any of these theories could ever get any traction, even amongst themselves. Of course, they don't care about traction amongst themselves, they care about traction amongst the mainstream. And so in that sense, one could say it is a kind of madness, because it's such an isolated, alone activity. It is a form of madness in some sense that is growing. There, in the last few years, the Natural Philosophy Alliance, which is the group that Jim helped to found, now has an international, it's got a huge database, huge website. They have 600 bona fide outsider theorists all around the world. Between them, they've produced like 300 books and 250 websites. They have video stream conferences every week. They have a conference. They produce a huge conference book of 700 pages of 120 theories. That's one. There's an even bigger organization called the Electric Universe. That group of people actually have something in common. This is a growing phenomenon. I don't think it's going to go away. It's an index of certain things about our society's relationship to science.
Before I ask you about that, I want to know, are they all Jims, or is there
James.
the odd Jane there?
There is the very, very rare Jane. They are almost universally men.
All guys, yeah.
Almost any other presupposition people have is wrong. They come from across the socio-economic spectrum. They come from, they're all ages. They come from all professions. I've met one who's a California Supreme Court judge. There's a famous Hollywood film director, Walter Murch, who cut a number of the Godfather films, who is a legend in Hollywood, has won 3 Academy Awards. He has an outsider physics theory. I've met artists, poets, backyard car dealers. The biggest category of them are engineers, so quite a lot of them are engineers. Some of them are actually people with degrees in physics. So they do come from all walks of life. Some of them are rich, some of them are poor, some of them are very rich. Stephen Wolfram, for instance, has an outside physics theory, and he even won a MacArthur Genius Award.
Yeah, astounding.
But they almost are university men.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you the final question about where all this goes, because you're leading up to the question of why in our age is this so clearly common. Now, you mentioned Lord Kelvin, who had some pretty strange ideas about whether something can be radioactive, rather strange about nuclear physics. There was also an astronomer royal who said that space travel would be impossible, and they could be proved very quickly very wrong, although Lord Kelvin went on to other glories. Now, what happens in a world where the outliers can become as significant, even politically, as orthodox science? In other words, they are turning up with their own facts, if you like, and in some ways negating orthodox science and trashing it in all sorts of important areas. which are making, I suppose, enlightenment and even progress impossible.
The people.
No, you're saying we outsiders are making enlightenment possible. No, that's what Einstein's done. Einstein's messed things up, and to get physics back on the right track, we need to chuck out a lot of the stuff which he's done, which is nonsense.
Write in my book are outsiders in a specific vein. Their field is theoretical physics. Theoretical physics is a very particular kind of science. They see themselves as it were, offering alternatives to Einstein. They see themselves as it were, offering alternatives to Einstein, string theory, and quantum theory. They are not in any way having any impact on anything that is a public policy issue. There are people who are putting forward outlying views negating climate change and objecting to evolution, and those people, particularly in the US, are having huge impacts on policy and increasingly on public education. I don't think that the people I writing about represent, however, is the difficulties that a lot of non-scientists are now having relating to science at all. And I think they are in some sense the positive end of a much darker spectrum, which is they are saying we love science, we believe it's the right way to understand the world, we can't understand the 10-dimensional theories that are coming out of things like string theory. We believe that nature speaks a language that the common man can understand. We will take science back for the people.
We take science back from the nonsense which Einstein has imposed upon us. Science can make sense. It's just a lot of stupid ideas, and they come into science from Einstein and people who followed on from Einstein's ideas.
We believe that nature speaks a language that the common man can understand. We will take science back for the people. They definitively want science for the people. Whereas climate change deniers and young Earth geologists,
World Trade Center truth people,
yes, effectively want to deny science and the evidence of science.
I don't think that is not a representation which is correct. It's sort of you've got a broad spectrum of different types of people. If you're going from Einstein is wrong and you want to apply that to climate change, and then science is built on Einstein in that direction is not going to be perfectly correct either. So you're just misrepresenting things a bit there.
Yes, effectively want to deny science and the evidence of science. My people don't want to deny the evidence of science. They want the evidence to produce a science that is comprehensible. And I think this is a real interesting social question. Who is science for? I mean, it's for all of us in an instrumental sense. But if many people cannot understand the, as it were, theory of the world that the universe gives us, then they are completely left out of relating to science in a meaningful way.
Those people should decide what Einstein's talking about is nonsense. You've got to have confidence in yourself when you're presented with ideas, and you should look at them and decide whether you think that makes sense or not. And when you're presented with something which a lot of people don't understand, you should still have confidence in yourself and say to yourself, "Is this sensible, isn't it?" And a lot of things that Einstein has given us is not sensible. It should be thrown out of science.
It leads to a sort of frustration and a sense of deep alienation from the world. In that sense, they do share something, particularly with the young earthers and the evolution deniers.
So what do we do about that?
That's really where my book ends. I have some ideas about that. We need first to have sympathy and understanding of the position they're in.
And friendliness, like you were with Jim.
And friendliness.
Instead of haughtiness.
Yes, well, the traditional term for these people has been cranks, which is just assuming that they're mad. I don't think these people are mad. I think the dilemma that they're facing is real, and we need to...
The dilemma we're facing is that we've worked out that Einstein is wrong, and there's too many people who've decided that they just don't understand science and they still want to believe it anyway. That's the dilemma we're facing. And we don't understand people who've done that. Why are people accepting things they don't understand on a sort of faith? When they're doing that, it is making science into a religion. Just why are there people like that?
Approach it with compassion and humanity. How we can solve it, I don't know. But I think that one of the things we need to do is to recognise that we have a problem.
You certainly have. Well, thank you very much.
So, from stage one of ignoring it, you're going to go to stage two and realise there's a problem, and then the next associated with that is to sort of like try to ridicule the issue.
Thank you.
That's the end of that one. Go on to the next one then. Next one is a bit shorter, I think. And some of the things are being covered again, but we're going through it again. That's the book she's done.
Hello, welcome to Connie Martinson Talks Books. My guest today, Margaret Wertheim, who is a science writer, has written an interesting book called Physics on the Fringe. It is subtitled Smoke Rings, Circulons, and Alternative Theories of Everything, published by Walker. Welcome, Margaret.
Lovely to be here, Connie.
And what were you were trained, what, as a scientist before you became a science writer?
Yes, I went to university and studied physics and mathematics and thought I would be a professional physicist, but ultimately decided to become a science writer and communicator instead.
Why? What was the difference?
I think one of the two things. One is I realised at university that although I loved the science, I didn't want to remain in a completely sheltered environment as physics was back then. And I also just realised I very much wanted to share my...
Sheltered environment, that is where they set at their dogma of believing certain things that come from Einstein and they're blocking dissent. That's the sort of sheltered environment she's got.
back then. And I also just realised I very much wanted to share my love of this subject with my friends. Many of my friends were artists and filmmakers, and they loved science but felt they couldn't understand the books that the physicists wrote, and so I wanted to write books and engage my friends with physics in ways that were really creative and innovative.
Well, Physics on the Fringe is based partly on a man named Jim Carter, who is a man who is, well, he's unique, as you portray him in this book, living on a trailer park that he owns, in a place that the name I find troubling pronouncing,
Enumclaw.
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 Yeah,
And that's a community about an hour south of Seattle.
And also, he had lived, which I thought was marvelous, on Catalina as an abalone fisher.
Yes, yes, in the 1970s. Jim was part of the abalone diving fleet, which sold abalone from Catalina all over the world to restaurants in New York and Tokyo and London, etc.
But it allowed him a week to work, but then a couple of months to do what he loved to do, which was invent.
Yes, Jim, and particularly what Jim loved to invent more than anything is theories of the universe, or a theory of the universe. He believes that he has found the true and final theory of the universe, which will basically mean that he's not only the next Einstein, but actually the next Newton. So people have been searching for the final theory of physics for a long time, and Jim believes he's found it.
Has he?
Well, that depends what you mean by the word final.
Sure.
I believe that none of the people I chronicle in my book are going to win the Nobel Prize for physics or ever be taught in physics departments at Stanford and Princeton and MIT. That said, I think they've done something extraordinary. I think Jim has given us a completely brilliant, imaginative conception of what the world might be. But I don't think he's ever going to be taught to physics students.
You said that you, as a science writer, that almost anybody who writes a thing on science sends it to you.
I get a lot of these in the mail.
Yes.
Particularly since the book's come out, I've got a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I have a whole library of them, hundreds of them. And that's what ultimately prompted me to write this book, is why there's so many people doing it. If it was just Jim Carter, one man alone, coming up with an alternative theory of the universe, it'd just be a quirky anomaly.
There has been a lot of loners, and now suddenly we are getting connected together. So it's becoming something you can't ignore so easily. The 3 stages of truth. Stage 1, ignore it, and stage 2 is to ridicule it, and stage 3 is to say it's obvious. But stage 1, when it's been loners, they've been able to ignore it, and now we're getting organised, and so it's not so easy to ignore it now.
But there are thousands of these people out there, and I wanted to try to understand why they're doing it.
Yeah, why?
Well, that's the question my book set out to try to answer. What does it mean that a man in a trailer park is trying to find his own theory of physics? And the conclusion I came to is basically that what's going on here is that people like Jim, they love science.
Have they been trained at all?
Mostly not. Some of them have, but mostly, like Jim has no training in science. He has no education after high school. But he loves science, and he feels that science is the right way to understand the world. But when he reads something like Stephen Hawking's book, A Brief History of Time, or Brian Greene's book about string theory, he can't understand it.
I have to tell you, I did a show with Brian Greene on string theory, and I really don't understand it, even having...
So the correct understanding from reading a book which seems doesn't make sense is to decide that it's wrong. That's if you've got confidence in yourself. Many of us have confidence in ourselves, and when we check these things out from what Einstein's saying and what these people were saying based upon what their beliefs in Einstein, we understand that it doesn't make sense and it's nonsense. But some people look at those books and decide, I'm just not clever enough to understand this, and they're going to just leave it as that.
Had it explained.
Well, I mean, and I think this is a fundamental problem now, is that these theories of physics are inaccessible to 99.99% of people, but yet we're told this is our theory of reality, and a lot of people just accept that and say, well, I'll never understand it. But people like Jim...
Those people are blocking progress. They should actually try to come to a conclusion, and the most sensible conclusion is to have confidence in yourself and realise what those sort of books are saying is nonsense.
A lot of people just accept that and say, well, I'll never understand it. But people like Jim say, no, I don't believe that nature speaks a language that the ordinary person can't understand. I believe that nature is accessible to me.
So they're coming to a conclusion after reading these sort of physics books, that they're nonsense, and that I consider a valid conclusion to reach from reading such books as that. So of course then it's a question of what do you do from that. Do you build your own theory, or do you go back to something else, go back to physics earlier, or do you join up with somebody else's theory?
That the ordinary person can't understand. I believe that nature is accessible to me. And these physicists, they've gone off on this wrong track.
Yeah.
And I'm going to
Those
work it out.
physicists who believe in Einstein have gone off on the wrong track.
And I'm going to work it out for myself.
Yeah.
How did you said you were at a bookstore and a friend of yours said, this just came in, I was going to dump it, but maybe you'll be interested?
Yes. I came across Jim because in 1993 he sent an announcement out about the imminent publication of his own book to a bunch of scientific booksellers.
Yeah.
And one of them happened to give a copy of this to me.
Yeah.
And I thought it was very audacious that, he was this man who had claimed that he'd reinvented physics from the ground up. He had a whole theory of subatomic physics, he had a whole theory of gravity, he had a whole theory of the creation of the universe, and he'd done it all himself, which is pretty audacious and, you know, some would say hubristic thing to do or to claim.
Besides Jim, who else have you had the time and interest to investigate their lifestyle?
A lot of the people in my book, I've just read their theories and thought about their theories. And there's a few people who I've actually met and really tried to understand personally. One of them is a theorist called Michael Evans, who lives here in Laguna Beach. He's not actually in the book. I encountered him after the book, but I looked in his life and his work quite a lot. One of the things that I find interesting about these people is that often they're incredibly bright, incredibly creative thinkers, but they've had little education.
They have nothing that they can use as a frame of reference.
That's right. So in a sense, they're beginning in a vacuum, and they've got all of these ideas about what makes sense, what should make sense. And so they start off on their own tangents, and then they...
Well, some of them start off on their own tangents, and some of them do actually check into the history of physics and so forth. So you've got lots of diversity and directions in they go in.
Get so into their own ideas, they can't actually hear any criticism based on, you know, experiments that have been done.
Well, we checked the experiments. Some of us have really checked into the experiments and what the mainstream have been saying about a lot of experiments is just complete misrepresentation. When you actually check into the experiments, like the famous Michelson-Morley experiment, then what the mainstream is saying about that experiment is false. And you also find out they're saying false things about things like GPS and so forth. They're just making false claims about Einstein's relativity, and even those people who believe in Einstein's relativity sometimes admit that yes, certain experiments can be interpreted in other ways than what Einstein's relativity is trying to impose on us. So that's the situation. Experiment has been subjected to a sort of distortion by Einstein. Einstein has sort of wanted to interpret experiments in a certain way. He's messed things up. He's messed up the maths. He's messed up the philosophy behind science and so forth. And it's just total nonsense and the sum total of all the things Einstein's done. So appeal to science, to experiments doesn't really work when you are talking about a theory which is nonsense.
Based on, you know, experiments that have been done. So it becomes, it's rather, at a certain point, the dialogue can't really go very far. Now, in Jim's case, he actually has read quite...
The dialogue can't go very far with the mainstream when the mainstream decides that it wants to believe in Einstein, and the beliefs based upon that don't really make any sense. It just blocks lots of dialogue.
A lot of science. So you can actually have really interesting conversations with Jim about mainstream physics, like why he thinks relativity is wrong or why he thinks quantum mechanics is wrong. Because he's really read quite a lot. But at some point still you have this problem. What is the interface between what you're doing and the world that physicists actually find out through?
Yeah, so the interface with mainstream physics from the alternative physics community is normally Einstein is wrong. You need to abandon everything you've done based upon Einstein and go back to something else. That's the interface.
Through these deep and rich experiments.
Theoretical physics is totally different from the pragmatic physics.
That's a very good point. And that's really the stumbling block that ultimately comes about for many of these people is they're doing theoretical physics. They're trying to found the foundations of reality. What's matter? What's space-time? How did the universe come into being? And they're not so interested in the application of it, like how do we make better microchips? How do we get rockets to fly to the moon?
Yeah.
And at some point, actually, theoretical physics, mainstream theoretical physics, produces theories that do actually help us to build better microchips. And that actually...
Well, we don't really think that is quite true. Science is really about trying to understand things, and engineering is about trying to make things work. So when you're talking about building things to work, we think that's more in terms of engineering. So you can have an engineer try to build you a microprocessor or electronic device of any type based upon quantum physics, and you just adapt it to adapt that quantum physics to what he needs to get his device to work, and that's engineering. But from an understanding point of view, there can be mistakes in that quantum physics which the engineer is going to ignore, and it's the understanding thing of science which is where the failure is happening. And of course part of that big understanding issue is the well-known quantum mechanics and Einstein's relativity does not really fit together properly. It doesn't. We don't have a unified theory, and so that understanding from mainstream physics is missing. And our explanation for most of us is that Einstein is wrong. Our understanding of reading Einstein and all those people working on Einstein is wrong. And so this problem which they have of trying to get a unified theory is based upon all the mistakes that Einstein has given them.
Come to realise is the stumbling block with these people. They want the theory, but they don't want to have to prove it by producing better microchips.
Yeah.
We just see it's completely false there that you prove a theory by making better devices. Making better devices, that's an engineering issue, not a science issue of trying to understand things.
And so there isn't this kind of continuum between theory and practice that is really the great achievement of contemporary mainstream physics.
When you went and spent time with Jim, he showed you what his machine that blows smoke rings.
Yes.
And then what is circulant? I mean, there are some drawings here that have to do with nitrogen-13 and various things that have to do with, well, almost if you were seeing Einstein's EM3.
Yes. Well, the pictures that we're looking at here are Jim's models of what he thinks atoms are made of. Jim believes that all matter is made up of these little ring-shaped particles, rather like my bracelet here, and that they interlock together in these kind of like subatomic chain mail. And he'd like to do some experiments to test his ideas about these circlons, and one naturally occurring form of it is a smoke ring. So in his backyard at Enumclaw, he makes giant smoke rings and bashes them together and sees how they behave, and it's amazing. When they actually bash together, they bounce off one another like billiard balls, which is really unexpected. They've got incredible integrity. They're really quite beautiful to watch.
And the circulon?
Well, the circlon is the name that Jim gives to these basically these ring-shaped particles, which he thinks is the fundamental structure of matter. He thinks that all matter is made up of these little ring-shaped particles, and that's the shape that he calls a circlon.
What does he think of quarks?
In Jim's theory, quarks don't exist. There's no such thing as quarks.
Oh.
In his theory, there are electrons, protons, neutrons, and mesons. They're four of the basic particles. And in Jim's theory, that's all there is. So all this other array of particles that physicists are finding now, like quarks and the Higgs boson that we've just discovered, in Jim's world, they're just fantasies.
I don't really want to go into lots of these alternative theories, but presumably based upon Jim's theory, he has an explanation for things which are called quarks and that. So what the physicists are calling quarks, he's probably explaining by other means.
Where does he go with all of these concepts from where he is now?
Well, he says that he's worked out the basic structure of physics. He's got a theory of nuclear physics, he's got a theory of the universe, he's got a theory of gravity.
Fine. Who's going to take that up and use his theories?
Well, he would like to think that one day his theories will be taught in physics departments at Harvard and Princeton and Stanford. So he believes that a new generation of young physicists will finally realize that he is right.
Oh, it's how marvelous to have that sense of security of your own invention.
And that is a remarkable thing about Jim. He is so convinced that his theory is right that it doesn't matter to him almost if he's recognized in his own lifetime. He'd like to be recognized while he's still alive. But if that doesn't happen, he's utterly sure that one day he will be.
He's very fortunate to have Linda as his wife.
Yes. Jim is a very wise man in a lot of ways, and he chose his wife extremely wisely. His wife, Linda, is a former social worker who worked in the King County social work system with disadvantaged and abused children. And she's the most level-headed, sane, and wonderful woman.
And their children?
They have 2 grown sons now, both of whom have very successful careers. One's a construction manager with successful business building things like Starbucks, and the other one is a computer programmer. So they're both highly successful young
So the
men.
computer programmer, in a way, pursued his field.
Well, Jim has a great interest in all things technical. And so, for instance, he's used computer programs, software, to make his own animations of the creation of the universe. And his son, in that sense, has followed in Jim's footsteps.
Now, you were not the first science writer to receive everybody's thoughts. This man on this page, De Morgan, has been he was a collector of all of these ideas.
Yes, in the 19th century there was a very famous mathematician, Augustus De Morgan, who was one of the great mathematicians of the 19th century, who spent 50 years collecting alternative theories of reality. And just after he died, a huge compendium of these theories was published. The whole book was called A Budget of Paradoxes, which I think is a fabulous name.
Yeah.
And what I was interested in about this is that this phenomenon is not new. It's been going on for at least 150 years.
Somebody has to be at the other end of this writing that I am doing, and thank God for the post office.
Exactly. And one of the things that I loved about De Morgan's book is that he's very...
Right, so we've got to pick this up now, part 2. Here we go.
He doesn't shy away from showing the logical flaws in the theories, but he's very sympathetic to the people. He never calls them cranks, and he's very particular about saying we should have some empathy for them, because what they're trying to do is do what real scientists do, which is learn about the fundamental nature of reality. This is a very human thing, and Morgan shows a lot of sympathy for ordinary people who want to understand the extraordinary nature of the universe. And I took my cue from him. I did not want to deride these people, which is so easy to do and which so many mainstream physicists do. We often call...
That'd be stage 2. Truth going through 3 stages. First stage is to ignore it, and when you can't ignore it anymore, you go to stage 2, which is ridicule it. So, just part of the steady process of science.
Mainstream physicists do. We often call them cranks, and that's a derogatory term.
Yeah.
And